So there's a little known quote floating around the internet, and it's by Mark Twain, one of the great American authors. If any of you out there have not read him, by all means, Huckleberry Finn and Tom Sawyer are classics I grew up on. And essentially, what Mark Twain's quote that really stuck out to me over the years, and I think I first heard it in 2020 when the whole world shut down, was don't let school get in the way of your real education. And first, you might be thinking, well, that's a little off kilter, right? Don't you go to school to learn? But in actuality, I have to say, out of all of my schooling, I probably learned the most in high school, but not from a teacher. Rather, in high school, they gave us an iPad program. They wanted us to make sure that we did not have to carry around textbooks, but Lord knows, we need some lifting every once in a while to, keep us strong. But on this iPad, there was no controls on the internet. And all I found was Wikipedia through my various escapades of boredom. And at the end of the day, I learned maybe one or two facts from the teachers, but probably most from Wikipedia and Google searching through, well, doom scrolling, I guess, in early form. But that brings us to today's discussion. My name is John Lewandowski, and I'm the founder and CEO of Podclass Pro, a premium immersive education website where you can find a teacher and we'll link you up with them and help you learn a foreign language and eventually subject. I'm joined today by our digital coordinator and one of our first coaches to join the website, our co-host, who's been on every episode thus far, Steve Trail. And we're bringing on a very special guest, someone I consider a good friend of mine, and a person that I actually subscribed to on YouTube years ago, and really helps to develop my philosophical understandings of geopolitics, philosophy, and the world. This is Rudyard Lynch of Whatifalthist. And thank you for joining me, Rudyard. How are
Hi,
you?
happy to be here.
I'm glad. So we brought you on to talk about immersion training and essentially how you learned outside of the school system. So, if you don't mind,
Sure
how
thing.
did What If Felt His start?
Um, so I'll bring this up later, but remind to ask me about this later. I have done language immersion programs. They're pretty similar to Podcast Pro. So when you said or podcast
Podclass.
your face is blocking the logo. Podclass, Podclass, yeah, Podclass. And so rem I'm reminding you to ask me about this later because when you said immersion, that's the first thing that came up in my mind. But I'm I'm Rudyard. I run a YouTube channel called Whatifalthist, which is about history, philosophy, geopolitics, anthropology, and generally trying to look to find the patterns in history to figure out how the world works and what the future is. And something about me is that I'm almost entirely self-taught. As John said, neither of us really learned much in high school. And the things that we did learn, or we didn't learn much in the institution of high school, we learned a tremendous amount independently. And that's something I've found is just normal for intelligent people because the school system doesn't teach anything interesting or useful. And I'm the same way where I run a history YouTube channel where we have millions of viewers and I only went to college for a semester, and that semester was during COVID. And so I'm basically everything I learned from What If Altist is stuff that I read independently from books. And I have a bunch of different bookshelves, but this is the bookshelf, one of my bookshelves. And that's a bookshelf on Asian and classical history. Over there is that's medieval and European history. And so there's a word called autodidact, which means you're self-taught, and that's what if autist is about, right? It's love to read and yet understand new parts of the world.
I couldn't agree more, honestly. Scrolling through all of those depths of Wikipedia, History Channel, and basically anywhere else, ultimately gave me a more nuanced perspective than, as we've said many times over on our social medias and podcasts here, the cookie cutter way that things are taught in our schools. To be
Yeah.
honest, I would go into school at 6, 7 o'clock in the morning and wouldn't get out till 3 and really think, well, what did I learn? Rather, I
Yeah.
wanted to learn about these great major battles. Like, for example, one of Napoleon's biggest hiccups was the Battle of Borodino, I believe, in, well, Russia. And that battle almost single-handedly turned the entire tide of the war against Napoleon and his invasion. We never covered things like that in our school classes. Steve, what about you? How did you get to your knowledge level today?
As you guys did, I read on my own. Really, a lot of that happened this summer after I graduated. I remember when you're reading a book, you're only getting, or when you're getting a one-on-one instruction, I might add from a tutor, you're only subject to that one philosophy of whoever you're learning from. And usually these people are very smart to begin with. You're learning from the smartest people in history who wrote the greatest books in history, and that's where you get your education. In school, however, these curriculums are designed by committees who push political ideologies. Like, for example, I was a history major when I began college, and um, I'd say 95% of the classes I took, they were heavily postmodern in their interpretation of history, and sometimes they were flat out wrong. Like, once I learned when we were taking Latin American history, they taught us about the Aztecs and the Mexicos, and my professor told me that the Aztecs were extremely effective against the Mexicans, and that their machohuitls, those really cool obsidian blades that they had, could shred through their steel armor like butter, so that the Spanish stopped using them and adopted the armor of the Aztecs. Well, I got very cocky in that, and I went to a real historian and told him that and said, "Hey, you're wrong." And he just said, "No, that's not true. That is objectively not true." But I was fed a straight up lie in my history class. And if you read an actual historical account of the events that Hernan Cortez himself wrote, in fact, a part of that is in Guns, Germs, and Steel, which is a decent read. It's not perfect in my opinion. You learn that I was wrong, and I had to go and find that on my own.
I do enjoy the self-study because, as someone that's gone through law school thus far, you learn that, well, eyewitness testimonies really are, not that great. Neither are secondary sources. What you need to know is the bare bone facts. You need to get that from a wide variety of sources to piece together what occurs. What we are fed in, I'm sure you both would agree with this, in our school system is, well, nowhere even near a coherent, I guess, amalgamation of what actually happened. We're hearing it from a teacher who heard it from a textbook that they got, who probably got that textbook from a college class, who heard it from a professor, and from a billion and a half other things. And at the end of the day, how much source material are we given? Maybe one or two.
Yeah.
And if we really think about it, people used to read Shakespeare and be able to completely understand it. And well, now today, the intelligence level and comprehension level, because they're so far removed from actual sources of information and real cognition, everyone thinks it's, oh, the end of your grades in English class because it's, quote, written in Old English, which is not exactly true.
Yeah, what I agree with what John said, and I in that when someone develops a view of the world or a philosophy, let's say Socrates, Aristotle, Francis Bacon, they're geniuses, but then over time, as that gets spread through telephone or word of mouth, it gets boiled down to some idiotic version of what the original version was be because it gets simplified with each step. And the last video I produced was why the education system failed. And I talk about it's a 1 hour video, so I can't summarize it for this podcast.
It was a very
But
beautiful video. I loved it.
thank you. But the two big reasons I found that our educational standards declined, because for the first third of the video, I was comparing the literary level of previous societies versus our current ones, where what I've found is that the best history writing was sometime around World War II, where the authors I respect the most were all writing in that time period, where the books that I think are the best at understanding history were all written around World War II. And nothing we write is at the same intellectual level. And that's something that we don't really think about because we always assume we're better than our ancestors. And the and I boiled it down to two distinct factors, one of which is we're a society where everything has to be standardized. So it's more important to create a standard product for schools than to make something good. And we're all roughly the same age here. We're all in our early 20s towards the end, like end of college age. And I think there are two educational experiences we've both experienced. One is standardized tests, where when I went to public school, we spent 4 months a year studying on how to take the test. There was no knowledge in the test. It's just hacks for what are the best ways you can fill out bubbles. And the other thing is political ideology, where we're all taught through a postmodernist leftist prism. And I am personally not on the left, but there are smart leftists. Karl Marx wrote a 1,000-page book with the theory of history and how it fits into philosophy and all that stuff. We're not being taught that kind of thing. What we're taught is a very simplified worldview of good versus evil. And I remember I could give a bunch of stories like this. Our school had a study of foreign culture week, and then we replaced it with social justice week, where the entire week was basically social justice propaganda. We'd have assemblies every week. And I had a bet with my friends 2 years in a row. For the first year, for every assembly that was about race, um, I'd get a quarter. Literally any other topic, my friend would get a quarter. The next year, any assembly that was about gender identity, I'd get a quarter. Literally any other topic, including social justice ones, my friend got a quarter. And I made money both of those years. And so what you're basically seeing is a combination of ideological capture, turning education into basically indoctrination, with a system that's designed to turn out factory workers. And both of them are why most people hate learning. And there are so few autodidacts or self-taught people because most people grow resentful at the process of learning itself from school.
Oh, absolutely. There are plenty of people that I can name off the top of my head that once we finished high school, I don't think they ever picked up a book again. They went to college.
Yeah,
Uh, I've never seen those people study, and quite a few of them went to my university where Steve and I met, and really feel like Steve and I were the only ones actually taking it seriously. While
yeah,
I had to look past a lot of things that were either said in the classroom or in the textbooks and try to find the snippets of truth that were
sorry,
left.
the Wi-Fi cut out.
Uh-oh. Are you still there, Rudyard?
Yeah, the Wi-Fi cut out for some reason. If it happens again, I'm gonna move from my office to my dining room because the Wi-Fi is on the other side of the house. So
Okay,
sometimes the Wi-Fi isn't very good in my office. So if it happens again, I'll move.
no
Um,
problem.
but
We can
What part
edit it
did you
out.
hear the last?
we got cut off at basically kids at your college didn't read.
Oh, yeah. So essentially, Steve and I were the only ones taking things, I guess, pretty seriously. We
Yeah,
ended with pretty good grades by our final year, and I still see to this day a lot of these people never picked up a book, and I can
yeah,
imagine that it's probably because of the cookie cutter mentality that we went through.
yeah.
Uh,
It's I mean, I know like 10 people in our age group who went to Harvard and not a single one of them reads. Um, because
it's all about the
if
phones now.
yeah, they're on their phones. Or the thing is, if you get to Harvard now, the selection pressure is so hard that the only thing you do if you go to Harvard is try to get into Harvard. So it's just, and the problem now is we're incentivizing people to be NPCs because the way our society works is that, or the way it worked until very recently, was your position in society was based off your college degree. And so we were incentivizing people to study and do nothing else. And then when you create that incentive, what you create is a person who knows how to study and nothing else.
Yeah, they know how to prep for an exam.
Yeah.
As you had said before, with 4 months of the year being put towards exam prep, for us it was the same thing. I went to private school, which at least on paper when I was growing up had a reputation of being better than public schools in the sense that, oh, it's more, I guess better in some way, but there's never really any
Yeah.
explanation for that. I can't even explain it now. We spent here in New York, I believe it was the Regents tests. I'm not sure what the equivalent for our grade school was. I don't really remember, but
Yeah.
we would have these tests where schools would get like, I don't know, the word on the street was $200 a student, and for private Catholic schools that were definitely not getting any money from the state because of the First Amendment, they loved it.
Yeah.
So my teachers would teach directly through the books, and I'm sure Steve probably had the same experience as I did.
Yep, right through the book. Not much else. You didn't have a teacher, you had an instructor. That's how I like to think of it. I didn't learn from these people, or if I did, I would have remembered them. I
Did
don't
either
remember
of
any
you
of
have
them.
those teachers that really made the switch go off in your mind? Say, "Ah, I really want to apply myself. I really want to, God forbid, leave the matrix and do something on my own."
I had one
No,
teacher.
sorry. I do have an example though of when we had a teacher who was not an instructor but an expert. One time in high school, I had a biology teacher, and she was quite boring, and I fell asleep in her class all the time. Um, but then one day she had a surgery and she was out for the rest of the year. So we had an actual trained biologist who had been doing biology for like 30 years. He came in to be an extended substitute. And my F went to like a C plus in that class. And he reached out to me. He knew how to explain these things because he'd been dealing with them for 30 years. He wasn't teaching out of the textbook. He was teaching out of his own experience. And that was very meaningful for me, even though I didn't end up doing biology. Sorry, go ahead, Rudyard.
Uh, Yeah, so I went to a public middle school and a private high school. And the thing was, actually, by the end of high school, I enjoyed school because we were all done with the college application process. And so after we were done with that, the school had a lot of really interesting classes because there was no pressure towards social advancement anymore. And there are two teachers that I remember, that I remember helped me a lot. One was my Latin teacher, who basically at the end he turned Latin class into a self-study project where you like do something you want to relating to the Roman Empire. And there was a teacher
Wow.
who I still really like, who was our because I went to a Christian it was vaguely it's legally Christian, but then it became woke over time. It's a sect of it was one of those very liberal sects of Protestantism.
Mm.
Uh, and our religious studies teacher, I'm still friends with him. He's a really cool guy. He was a former Black Panther, and he
Wow.
went to Harvard. Then he taught in the Hood after that, and he studied philosophy and religion. And um, he's an incredibly interesting person. And one of the really weird disjoints about my life was before I was age 17 or 18, I didn't think I was that smart. I didn't think I would do anything with my life because my entire feedback for all of my schooling was you need to punctuate better, you need to study math more. And so all the focusing was on the things I was bad at. And then after I was out of high school, my YouTube channel took off. And then people kept on saying, Rudyard, I love your work in blank, blank, blank. What you're doing is great. And so there's this really weird disjoint in my head between myself from school, which didn't I kind of thought I didn't see myself very highly, and then myself from my YouTube channel, which I mean I'm one of the big history YouTubers now. And so that transition happened really quickly. And it was honestly brought a lot of emotional turmoil to me because I didn't know how to reconcile that shift. But the teacher I told you about, the former Black Panther religious guy, he was one of the very few teachers where he said, Rudyard, if you apply yourself over your life, you will be successful. And he said, he told me, I think you should become a professional philosopher. And because you're good at that, and I want to see what philosophy you develop. And so he was a teacher where he actually did encourage me to learn. But that's something that's pretty rare.
Absolutely. I think I have maybe two or three, not of the same magnitude, but ones that actually cared, that
Yeah.
realized, well, going through the system and just following, this path that's been laid out by the boomer generation for, I would say, probably the last 50, 60 years of
Yeah.
go through school, go to college, get a degree, you can have your white picket fence house and a job that pays $70,000 a year, and you'll be happy.
Yeah.
that no longer exists in today's world. And there's a whole myriad of factors of why that doesn't, that would take probably
Yeah.
hundreds of hours to go over. But there were some that said, that's not sustainable for long term. It's not what we should be doing. We push people to bigger and better heights. And it
Yeah.
seems like you had the good guidance. And I had a question actually about you had said that you had only gone for one semester. What was the
Yeah.
pinnacle? What was the moment you realized that the modern education system wasn't for you and you decided, you know what, we're going to push all the chips in, we're going to go with this YouTube thing and become that professional philosopher?
It was weird where I went into college and I took a gap year and I was stuck at home for the second half of that gap year due to COVID. And I worked really hard on the channel because frankly I had to have something to do or I'd go crazy. I was stuck at home in rural Pennsylvania. I was sick with COVID for a month, so my dad didn't let me leave my room. And so that I wouldn't infect the rest of my family. So I was just needed something to do. So I turned my channel into my full-time job over COVID. And by the time I went to college the next year, or end of 2020, um, I was already making a living wage off YouTube, but I kept doing it over college. And what happened was that by December of 2020, I was making enough money off YouTube that I knew that it basically made no sense for me to stay in college. And this is where the story gets crazy. That December, a friend of mine who's a tech CEO reached out to me, or I met him where he reached out through Patreon and he invited me to a social club of talented young people with like NBA stars, Netflix actresses, CEOs, all under the age of 27. And I was brought in as their intellectual guy. And so that opened up a whole new world where I had this community of other young people. And almost all the guys in that were dropouts, where I find almost most all successful young men under the age of 30 they're either dropouts or they're people who had other projects besides college. And then my buddy said, "Hey, I'm having an event for like tech CEOs in Mexico. Do you want to live in Mexico for me?" And he said, "You should drop out of school. I dropped out of school. I'll help you." And so with my friend, I dropped out of school, moved to Mexico, lived there for 3 months, and he brought 20 of his tech CEO friends. And we rented out a bunch of houses by the beach and we partied together for 3 months. And so and
That's
I wanted
awesome.
to finish the year, but then he said, "No, Rudyard, you should just do this now. This is awesome." And so I cut a deal because I had to have one credit to finish that year. So I was friends with the medieval history professor. So I took a remote class on the medieval history of West Africa when I was in Mexico. And that was a great class. I learned a lot of things I wouldn't otherwise learn.
Is that like
Um,
Mansa Musa?
yeah, exactly. Um, and it's a really weird historic period. I mean, I could go on a whole tangent about this, but it's one of those historic time periods where it's within living memory. But one of their historic accounts from the 13th century is it's the Blacksmith Guild fighting against the Hunters Guild, and they both have magical powers. And the war starts because the dragon that makes gold dies. And so they have to hunt a magical buffalo to reap its power to install himself as king. And so the leader of the Blacksmith Guild is a powerful wizard, and he must install himself as king. And this is
That's
in the
cool.
13th century. So this is the sort of thing you hear about from like 3,000 years ago in Europe or Asia, but it's weird to see a society that's pretty recent in living memory have such a different view of the world.
Yeah, I can see why that's an awesome class to take, especially over
Yeah.
Zoom. And you said you were on the beaches, right?
Yeah, yeah.
Damn. We went to school in a frozen wasteland.
I went to
So
school in Maine, so that's true too.
yeah,
But it
it
was
was
funny. I
dark
still
6 months
remember.
of the year.
Yeah, I remember I left Maine. I visited my right-hand man, Merrick in Boston. He wasn't my right-hand man. We were just friends. And I drove down to Philadelphia. And so it was April, so I saw the full range of climates. I started out in Maine, and then by the time I went down to Philadelphia, it was just beautiful spring, where in Maine it was still winter. And then I took a flight to Mexico. So I like to think that in the matter of a week, I saw the full climactic shift.
Wow, I wish we had those opportunities. Unfortunately, our school, when they had the, I guess they like to call it immersion training, but
Yeah.
not really. It was go over to, I don't know, I'm guessing Italy probably, as everyone does. We're gonna stay there for a month and study the Western humanities. If you know Italian, great. If not, who cares? You know, it's
It
all in
sounds
English
pretty basic.
anyway.
You can speak Italian.
Yeah, exactly. If you don't know Italian, doesn't
This
matter.
is New York. One of the Sopranos paid for that program to subsidize the Italian American community.
Exactly. Exactly.
Yeah.
But I don't know. It really wasn't something that you can go to and just be like, wow, I have this eye-opening experience that really brings me into a whole new culture. And speaking of that, you had mentioned before to remind you about the immersion training. You mind telling us
Yes.
a little bit about that?
So on my gap year, I went to France and I went to a French language immersion school. And I did that for 3 months. And I took for my entire schooling from kindergarten until 12th grade, we had some kind of language program, either French or Latin. And in those 3 months in France, I learned more language that I retained than the entirety of my schooling combined. And the way it worked is that um, they put you in a classroom with a French speaker. And I was one of the very few English speakers there. And they would have you have a conversation, and through intuition, you had to figure out what the French speaker was talking about. And it was fun. We only had 3 hours of class a day, which I think was great because we found in studies you could only really learn for 3 or 4 hours a day. And I learned the French really quickly because it was something that actually involved me thinking and doing something rather than just through rote. Or as Steve said, it was teaching rather than instructing.
So you'd essentially just be locked in the classroom and have to use context clues, right?
Yeah, basically, they locked you in a classroom. They wouldn't speak English. Most people in my class were Spanish speakers, and so
Ah,
they wouldn't use any English for
they
us.
got the cheat code.
Yeah, I mean, because Spanish and French are so close. So I'd see them make jumps that I wouldn't because the context was easier in Spanish than English. Um, and so they'd make us figure out what they were talking about, and then that process forces you to remember it in the same manner where if you, with your favorite video game, if you played at age 10, you remember that much more than anything you learned in class at age 10 because it's useful to you, or not useful. You remember and enjoyed the process of playing that video game. You were invested in it. In our educational system, there's no investment.
I could tell you basically how to get to a high rank or second, third, fourth prestige in Black Ops 1 or
Yeah.
Modern Warfare 2, more than I can tell you that I learned between the ages of K through 8.
Yeah, basically.
Ultimately, at the end of the day, I personally think that immersion is the way to go in terms of
Yeah.
whether that's a language, as you and I both have done. That's how I learned Polish. Essentially, made some Polish friends, hired a tutor, and said, speak to me. We'll go from
Yeah.
there. And I cannot really explain how I made those mental jumps to be able to
Yeah.
figure out what people were talking about, unless it was a day where my friends dragged me in front of a car and be like, "Oh yes, samochod. It is a car."
Yeah.
Things like that. But my brain was able to figure it out after a while. It's either
Yeah.
pattern recognition or just constantly shaking my head, being like, please rephrase that. And then all of a sudden, a word that I found out was there. And
Yeah.
immersion does not have to be just with language, it could be with anything. Arguably, I would say all three of us have inducted ourselves into a secret order of immersion training through basically everything that we know today. If you're self-made,
Yeah.
if you're self-learned, that's immersion
Yeah.
training.
And that's how life is, and it's with all skills. I remember, for example, living in Mexico, I learned so many skills how to be an adult from just hanging around with other adults. I learned, I vastly improved how I dressed, how I talked, how I did my business because I was hanging out with people who are more mature than me. It's funny saying that when you go where you were basically at a party house. But those are useful skills, and that's the sort of thing that we don't think about, where learning doesn't have to be rational. And actually, learning is best done when it's emotional. You will not remember something unless if there's not an emotional investment attached to it.
Exactly.
Yeah,
Like what's the
that's why the apprenticeship the apprenticeship model worked for a very long time. If you didn't go to school, you had a master and you were an apprentice, and you learned directly from him every day. You lived with him. Say you became a blacksmith or a shoemaker, and it worked. And that's how that system was very stable. And there are things we can learn from that way of thinking, for sure.
It reminds me of Xenophon's The Education of Cyrus. Essentially was the same way. I don't know if you two read the book, but that was one of the few books in college I was forced to read that I actually have to say, you know what? I'm going to buy this textbook. It was a perfect reprint of it. And essentially, it's a 500-page book summed up into about a handful of sentences, is that Cyrus was educated. Granted, this is a fictional version of Cyrus. Was educated amongst a very small eclectic group of young teens that were his age, and assigned to them were the elders of the community. And the elders, not in the sense that there are old folk, 80 plus, but rather people at various stages of life that were either warriors, kings, senators, representatives, whatever. And they learned their trade and how to become the well-rounded individual that could navigate a aristocratic world like that. Persia back in the day, or rather, I believe it was the Kingdom of Medea, if I'm not mistaken, or that might have been Saudi Arabia.
Medea is modern Azerbaijan, which
Yeah,
was inhabited by Persia. The
it's
Medians and the
mountains.
Persians are ethnically so close as like Canadians and Americans.
Yeah, basically.
Yeah.
And essentially in that kingdom, there was not much going on in the sense of agriculture and things like that. It was a very rough existence. And if there is a grain of truth on how Cyrus was educated, that explains a lot in terms of what the book said. Uh,
Yeah.
People at all stages of life in this warrior caste that he was a part of guided him, and they had the emotional connections with him to be able to develop him into probably one of the greatest humans that had ever lived. And honestly, that's what we're trying to replicate over here at Podclass Pro. Steve runs a great course on the classics, essentially, where in a pod class, which is of composition of maybe 3 to 5 people, you have one person moderating and discussing things and leading that talk. We, break down different historical texts that are within the Western canon. Of course, we plan to branch out, but in this hyper-specific one, and we go through the classics that are the foundations of Western civilization. We discuss it. I believe that that is as close as we're going to get at the moment to what Xenophon discussed about true education. But ultimately, you need people that are competent around you. There's always the business thing thrown out that your net worth is your social circle. Sort of true. You become the sum of basically everybody that you're around. So if you surround yourselves with the experts, as we try to do here, you're going to become something. And well, all you have to do is take that first step. So, Rudyard, we want to thank you for joining us here today. Thank you, Steve, for coming in as well. My name is John Lewandowski. I'm the founder and CEO of Podclass Pro. And yeah, any closing remarks, fellas?
It's been a pleasure. Thank you for having me.
Absolutely. What
I
about
have
you,
one.
Steve? Go for it.
I want to call back to something that the late great John Milton once said, and it was along the lines of, for books are not dead things because they still contain in them the living intellect of those who wrote them. So go out there, read a book, surround yourself with smart dead people. Thank you very much.
Beautifully said. Smart dead people. Who would have thought that these old books that smell of their owners that are in the libraries or even in my house here would teach us so much.
An idea is to finish, an idea is a living thing. You see Christianity as an example. Christ's personality has impregnated billions of people over history, and that you've seen little bits of Christ's personality rub off on Christians. Karl Marx, you saw his ideas breathed in the whole societies, where these philosophic concepts that came out of Marx's head suddenly created policy and life for millions of people or hundreds of millions of people. So try to fill your mind with good dead ideas.
Absolutely. And you can find us on podclasspro.com, Whatifalthist on the YouTube channel over there. And well, you find us on various social medias, Facebook, Twitter, Instagram, whatever. All right, my friends, don't be like Big Ed, Big Education. Book yourself a pod class instead. See you next time. Take care.